All right, so let's dive into this topic you wanted to explore further.
Yeah,
It's a whole evolving relationship between the Catholic Church and gay priests.
right.
And you specifically mentioned a YouTube video by John Futal,
Yeah, it's Chuma-san.
Tima Aldia,
Yeah,
and he had some really intriguing points.
he did.
And it really got me thinking about how
Yeah.
the church has had this like really rigid stance on homosexuality
Mhm.
historically.
Of course.
And obviously that's had a big impact on gay men who felt a calling to the priesthood.
For sure, it's created a lot of tension,
Yeah,
navigating your faith while also kind of grappling with this aspect of yourself that's been condemned.
right.
It's led to a lot of priests just feeling like they have to be secretive
Yeah.
and, struggling to reconcile their personal lives with their vocation.
And that's what makes this recent shift in the Italian church so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
They've actually started admitting gay men into the priesthood
Yeah,
while still upholding celibacy as a requirement.
right.
So it begs the question,
Mm.
is this like a sign of genuine change or just a superficial adjustment?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't
Yeah.
it? And to really understand what's going on, we have to unpack what this shift actually entails.
Okay.
The Italian Episcopal Conference,
Right.
basically the governing body of bishops in Italy,
Okay.
they issued these new guidelines for evaluating candidates for the priesthood,
Okay.
and they're moving away from solely focusing on a candidate's sexual orientation.
So it's not just like, are you gay or not?
Right, and they're pushing for a more holistic evaluation.
So like they're looking at the whole person.
Exactly. Celibacy is still a core requirement for all priests, regardless of their sexual orientation.
Got it.
But now the selection process also considers things like the candidate's political views,
Okay.
their social vision, the authenticity of their calling to serve.
Interesting. So like, are they actually cut out to be a priest or are they just trying to, hide?
Exactly.
Yeah,
But it does kind of raise a bit of a paradox, right?
it does.
I mean, if celibacy is the absolute
Oh.
rule, why should sexual orientation even be a factor?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking about. It's like, why does it matter
Yeah.
if they're going to be celibate anyway?
Exactly. And to understand that, we kind of have to delve into the church's complex
Yeah.
and often fraught relationship with
Oh, yeah.
sex power and control.
Yeah.
And this isn't just a modern issue.
Yeah.
This goes way back.
Historically, right.
Yeah.
So in our prep, you mentioned that the ban on priestly marriage
Hmm.
wasn't always a thing.
Right.
When did that change?
Well, for centuries, priests were allowed to marry and have families.
Okay.
The ban came about in the 12th century.
Okay.
And it was driven in part by concerns about church property.
Okay.
When priests had families, there was this tendency for church land and wealth to be passed down through inheritance.
Okay. So the church was losing its stuff.
Exactly. It was diminishing their holdings.
So this was kind of a way to consolidate their power and wealth?
That was definitely a significant factor. But, it also tied into this deeper anxiety surrounding sexuality and the church's attempts to regulate it.
Right.
Celibacy became this way to elevate the priesthood and
Right.
position them as these otherworldly figures.
Right. Not tied down by earthly.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's interesting how these like historical power dynamics
Mm-hmm.
still shape the conversation today.
Oh, absolutely. They're totally intertwined. And then,
Yeah.
to complicate matters further,
Yeah.
the church had to grapple with the so-called sexual revolution.
Right. In the 20th century.
Yeah, and they saw this as a challenge to their authority and traditional values.
Yeah.
This led to this perception of sex as a battleground in this larger cultural war.
And, in that context, gay priests become almost like a lightning rod for those anxieties.
Yeah,
Even if they're committed to celibacy.
right.
It's almost like the church can't reconcile its doctrine
Mm-hmm.
with the realities of lived experience.
Yeah, you've got...
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and, the church's stance on homosexuality,
Uh-huh.
it often feels rooted in these, interpretations of scripture
Yeah.
that a lot of people see as outdated
Yep.
and honestly harmful.
Right. And it's especially difficult to reconcile when you consider stories
Mm-hmm.
like that of Jesus Donaire,
Yeah,
this former priest who served for almost 2 decades,
yeah.
but was ultimately forced out
Mm-hmm.
because he chose to live openly as a gay man.
Right.
And his story really resonated with me.
Yeah.
It's like, here's this man who felt a genuine calling to the priesthood,
Yeah.
dedicated his life to serving others,
Mm-hmm.
and yet
Yeah.
he's rejected for simply living authentically.
Right. It kind of exemplifies the church's struggle
Yeah,
to reconcile its doctrine with the lived experiences
Right.
of LGBTQ plus individuals.
like, can an institution like the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
with its deeply entrenched traditions
Right.
and interpretations of Scripture? Can
Yeah.
it really evolve
Yeah.
to embrace, like, greater inclusivity?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, or will it just stay tethered to these views that
Yeah.
even people within the church find increasingly difficult to justify?
And speaking of potential for change,
Yeah.
we got to talk about Pope Francis.
Of course.
He's been making waves
Yeah.
with his more inclusive approach.
Yeah. More pastoral.
Yeah, it's not like a complete overhaul or anything.
Right.
But, there have been some noteworthy shifts
Oh, yeah.
in tone and even
He's emphasized compassion and understanding. He's repeatedly stated that being gay is not a crime or a sin.
Mm-hmm.
And he's actually taken concrete steps
Okay.
to welcome LGBTQ plus individuals into the church community.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, for example, he's allowed gay individuals to serve as wedding witnesses and godparents,
Oh, wow.
which are, pretty significant roles within Catholicism.
Yeah, those are big steps considering the church's past stances.
For sure.
It's almost like he's trying to shift the focus away from sexual acts.
And more toward, like, a more holistic understanding of love and commitment.
Yeah, like who the person is rather than what they do.
But he's facing pushback, right?
Oh, absolutely.
There are these powerful factions within the Vatican
Okay.
and in dioceses around the world who are holding on to a more conservative interpretation of doctrine.
Right, so they see any movement towards greater acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals as like a threat.
Yeah, a threat to the church's moral authority.
So it's like this tug of war
Yeah.
between those seeking change
Yeah.
and those clinging to tradition.
And that's where the Italian church's decision to admit gay men into the priesthood while upholding celibacy, it becomes even more nuanced.
Yeah.
It's like a tentative step toward greater acceptance.
Right, but with this big caveat.
Exactly.
Do you think this could be like a compromise?
It's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, some argue that it's just a pragmatic response to the declining number of priests.
Yeah, just trying to get more people in.
Exactly. Broaden the pool of candidates without fundamentally changing anything.
Right.
But then others see it as like a genuine attempt to move toward greater inclusivity.
Yeah.
Recognizing that sexual orientation doesn't negate someone's ability to serve.
It's fascinating,
Isn't it?
how this one decision has sparked so much debate and interpretation.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, this conversation also brings us to a darker aspect.
Okay.
Conversion therapy.
Yeah.
It's disturbing that this practice still exists
It is.
within certain sectors of the church,
Yeah.
despite being condemned by, medical and psychological
No,
professionals. As
it's
far as-
awful premise that sexual orientation can be changed.
Right.
And it often leads to feelings of shame,
Yeah.
psychological trauma.
And Pope Francis himself
Mm-hmm.
has spoken out against conversion therapy.
He has.
But it's concerning that some church leaders,
Yeah.
like usually in Spain,
Yeah.
haven't really taken a firm stance against it.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, that contrast between Italy and Spain is like the Italian church is taking these tentative steps
Right.
towards greater acceptance,
Yeah.
but the Spanish church is known for
Yeah.
its more conservative stance.
Yeah, and its resistance to Pope Francis's reforms.
So it really highlights the diversity of viewpoints
Mm-hmm.
and the internal struggles within the Catholic Church.
Yeah, it's important to remember
Yeah.
that the Catholic Church isn't this, like, monolithic entity. It's a global institution with diverse cultural contexts,
Right.
varying levels of openness to change.
So zooming out a bit,
Okay.
what do you see as like the main obstacles to achieving greater acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals
Yeah.
within the church?
Well,
What needs to happen for real lasting change?
yeah.
I mean, it feels like we're talking about a fundamental shift in understanding.
Yeah.
Like, is it even possible for an institution like the Catholic Church
Right.
to really reconcile its traditional doctrine with, the growing acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals?
Yeah, that's the core question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there are easy answers.
Right.
One of the biggest obstacles is, as we've been talking about, these deeply entrenched power structures.
Bro.
Within the church, there's strong resistance from conservative factions,
Yeah.
particularly within the Vatican,
Okay.
and certain, influential dioceses.
Right.
They view any deviation from traditional interpretations of Scripture as a slippery slope,
Yep.
that afraid it'll undermine the church's authority
Right.
and lead to this, like, erosion of moral values.
So they're holding on to a very specific worldview
Right.
that feels increasingly at odds
Yeah.
with the lived experiences.
Yeah, and not just theological interpretations.
Yeah.
There's also the financial aspect.
Right.
Powerful dioceses, particularly in wealthy nations,
Uh-huh.
they wield significant financial influence within the church.
Right.
So their opposition to change
Yeah.
can create a very real roadblock.
So it's this complex web
Yeah.
of theological arguments,
Uh-huh.
power dynamics,
Uh-huh.
economic interests.
Right. It makes you wonder, is genuine change even possible
Yeah.
within such an entrenched system?
Yeah.
But, I think it's important to remember that the church has evolved
Yeah.
over its long history.
Of course.
I mean, change is always possible,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's slow and incremental.
Right.
I think what's needed is continued dialogue,
Yeah.
both within the church and in broader society,
Okay.
challenging outdated interpretations of Scripture,
Uh-huh.
fostering greater understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity,
Right.
promoting a more compassionate and inclusive approach within the church.
Yeah.
These are all essential steps.
And it seems like the voices of those who've been marginalized,
Mm-hmm.
like Jesus Donaire,
Yeah.
they're becoming increasingly difficult to ignore.
Yeah, their stories are powerful.
Yeah.
They remind us of the human cost of these rigid doctrines.
Right. And the need for change.
Yeah, and, it's not just about advocating for LGBTQ plus individuals within the church.
Right.
This conversation has broader implications for how we think about the role of religion in modern society.
Okay.
It raises questions about the tension between tradition and progress, the importance of critical thinking,
Uh-huh.
challenging long-held beliefs, even when they're deeply ingrained in our culture.
So even for those who aren't Catholic
Aye.
or particularly religious,
Yeah.
this deep dive offers valuable insights
Yeah.
into how institutions grapple with evolving social norms
Absolutely.
and the complexities of human experience.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play
Yeah.
in creating a more just and compassionate world,
Okay.
whether it's advocating for change within our communities, challenging discriminatory attitudes,
Mm-hmm.
or just listening with empathy to the experiences of others.
Well said.
Thanks.
To wrap things up,
Okay.
let's circle back to the Italian Church's decision to admit gay men into the priesthood
Right.
while upholding celibacy.
Yeah.
It's clearly a complex issue
It is.
with no easy answers.
For sure.
It could be seen as a pragmatic response to dwindling priest numbers,
Yeah.
a genuine step toward greater inclusivity,
Right.
or maybe a combination of both.
Could be.
It definitely reflects the ongoing struggle
Mm-hmm.
within the church to reconcile traditional doctrine
Yeah.
with the realities of a changing world.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's up to each individual
Right.
to grapple with these questions and decide where they stand.
Mm-hmm.
Can the church truly embrace a more inclusive vision of itself?
Yeah.
One that recognizes the dignity and worth of all people, regardless of their sexual orientation?
Right.
Or will it remain tethered to interpretations of faith
Hmm.
that many find increasingly difficult to reconcile with their own lived experiences?
It's a lot to ponder.
Yeah,
But I think these are conversations worth having,
I agree.
even if they're uncomfortable at times.
Yeah.
So a huge thank you to you
Oh, you're welcome.
for sharing your expertise and helping us navigate this complex and fascinating topic.
Happy to be here.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
We hope it's given you some food for thought
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even inspired you to continue exploring these issues in your own lives.
That would be great.
And as Jean Fatol always says on his channel, Antima Al Dia, hello, if you are listening to this, you may not be subscribed to the channel. Activate the bell so that they will notify you when there's a new story and share it with the people you want. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.